So yeah, feel free to ask any questions if you guys want. I know I covered a lot last time, but the video got erased. So for anybody that wasn't able to tune in or ask any questions, yeah, fire away. I had a couple messages earlier today from some people that were interested in scaling up their sort of brews. How do you avoid sediment in a drink before bottling? Well, then you would probably need some sort of filtration. Every kombucha brewer sort of uses a different level of filtration, and it's totally up to you if you're just trying to get rid of the sediment, or if you're trying to get rid of the yeast, or if you want a fully shelf-stable product. If you're brewing at home and you want to remove sediment, the best thing to use is just cheesecloth and just pour through that directly. If you are brewing on more of a commercial scale, you would want to invest in a larger filter, something called a plate filter. If you go to a website called Vigo, V-I-G-O, I think it's .com or .co.uk, I'm not exactly sure. They'll have different filters available, and they have a kombucha section, so you can look through that. And a plate filter can go anywhere from 20 micron or more, and all the way down to sterile, so which would be around 0.45. So it's entirely up to you, of course, what you want to filter to. Different levels, different micron levels will filter out different things. So yeast will remain to a certain extent when you're above sort of a 10 micron, something like that. And then when you go all the way down 0.45, that's when you remove the bacteria, which actually, as we know, based on all the research out there, doesn't actually have any impact on your gut health. I know I talked about this last time, but the only scientifically backed evidence of why kombucha is good for you is because of the acids, mainly the acetic acid produced by the bacteria, or the antioxidants from the tea itself. So I don't know if that's a long-winded way of answering your question about avoiding sediment in the bottle. But it's always difficult when stockists or wholesalers say they're going to keep your product chilled or refrigerated, but then somebody leaves it out in the summer in a warehouse that's non-refrigerated, or they leave it outside, or for some reason it's stored in like a back room somewhere in a small organic shop or something like that. That's when secondary fermentation happens. So it is important to at least remove some of the sediment and some of the yeast. What I find, if you're brewing at home, doesn't really matter. It's totally fine to have a completely unfiltered kombucha. But the thing is, from our perspective, being in the UK, where there's not sort of refrigerated logistical networks set up to the extent that there are in places like America or Australia or maybe some other countries, it means that you don't have full visibility and assurance into how your product's going to be stored, even if someone says they're going to store it at the right temperature, and you get secondary fermentation, which not only makes your product too sour or too fizzy, but it can also make it alcoholic. And then at that point, the issue would be that your kombucha is above the legal limit, which in most Western countries, in Europe and in the States, and in Australia and New Zealand, needs to be at 0.5% or lower to be classified as a non-alcoholic drink. So yeah, I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but in 2010 in America, they pulled all the kombucha from the shelves in Whole Foods Market because I guess a representative from the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, which is a strange organization in the States. It's funny they loop all those things in together. Had a report somewhere on the East Coast that there were bottles of kombucha fizzing on a shelf in Whole Foods. And he looked into it, he tested it, turned out that kombucha was in fact 2.5% alcohol. So, a lot of people, as we know, drink kombucha as an alternative to alcohol. So the idea is to make something, that everyone can drink. You can give to your kids, you can give people that, don't drink alcohol for various reasons can enjoy. So why do you filter again after carbonating? We don't filter after carbonating. All of our filtration is done pre-carbonation. And the reason for that is that when you put liquid through more and more processes, it's going to remove carbonation. So the ideal scenario is that you would have liquid, put it through the filtration that you want, then carbonate it, and then send it directly in a bottle through whatever system you use, so you don't lose fizziness along the way. I guess one way around that is to over fizz your kombucha, so that if you do put it through filters while it's fizzy, you still retain some of that. The problem though would be that once it gets into bottle, it might be a bit too fizzy, and then you'll have foaming and you'll lose a bunch, as I'm sure a lot of you guys have dealt with if you're running a kombucha brewery. You know, trying to get that kombucha in a bottle, if you've carbonated it, it can be difficult at times. You can lose a lot. Bonjour from France. Do you account for the sugar in your starter liquid or SCOBY when you're speaking about using 40 to 60 grams of sugar per liter? So we use, personally on our big scale brews, we use 50 grams of sugar per liter. And you can use, sorry, my dog is throwing around a ball right now. So that's a noise. That doesn't include the starter liquid. The starter liquid is a separate thing. This is simply for that brew, like without taking into account the starter liquid. So we have a formula though that we will, on a larger scale, like on average, I'm saying that we use 50 grams per liter, but sometimes we'll adapt that on the rest based on the recipe. But standard brews, what we recommend is 50 grams per liter, and that doesn't necessarily include the starter liquid. So. Let's see, when flavoring with tea, do you brew a concentrate and add a base kombucha, or do you cold brew in your base? Have you ever tried brewing your base kombucha with flavored tea? Good question. I've personally done small batches of flavored tea based kombucha. I always recommend that when you're brewing with anything other than Camellia sinensis, I mean the classical green, black, oolong, white, you know, those pure kinds of teas without any extra oils or flavorings, I recommend you keep your sort of core brew just that, and then you can go off on the side and experiment, because over time we've seen, or I've seen in my personal brews in smaller batches, the SCOBY degrades over time if you give it too many oils. So for instance, a chamomile or a peppermint, something like that. What I would recommend is almost dry hopping those into your finished kombucha. So brew an original kombucha using whatever tea base that you like. Ideally a lighter tea, something like a sencha, maybe something like a light green tea, if you don't want too much flavor coming out of it. And then after you fermented it for however long it is you like to ferment, 10 days, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, whatever, then overnight do like a dry hopped, or essentially I guess at that point it would be a cold infusion of peppermint or chamomile or any herbs, spices, whatever, dried plant matter to extract flavor from it. So I'd keep that on the side, sort of. So that's, it would simply be used in the same way that you would sort of add any kind of fruit flavoring or anything like that. In a home brew, you chop up fruit, you can put it in, let it sit for a few days, extract all the flavor, the color, the essence of the fruit. In a similar way, you could do that with any kind of tea or any kind of dried plant matter. Something we talk about is kombucha doesn't need to just be brewed with tea. As I mentioned, keep your core brew as a Camellia sinensis brew, but then you can experiment with anything on your little side batches. Like yesterday I made a guayusa kombucha. I talked about this before. Guayusa is an Amazonian holly tree native to Ecuador, and it's amazing. It contains quite a bit of caffeine, but also a lot of theanine. So what you also find in tea, so it actually relaxes your nervous system as the caffeine sort of enters your bloodstream. It also contains theobromine, and it has twice as many antioxidants as green tea. So guayusa is one of my favorite things in the world. I drink it every single day. If you're in the UK, you can buy it from a company called the Guayusa Tea Co. It's really good, really interesting brew. And I'm pretty sure that there's a couple of breweries maybe in London that do it. Kitty's Kombucha might do a guayusa brew. You can flavor with any kind of tea. Anything you can just leave in water for a period of time will extract the flavor. So I hope that answers your question. Let's see. While bottling, how do you stop the fermentation or carbonation? In terms of stopping the fermentation, as long as your liquid is chilled below 5 degrees Celsius, that will slow the fermentation right down. So as long as you keep your liquid chilled, if you're brewing commercially, you have a bright tank, something like that, and your bright tank will mean that you can have a glycol jacket or something like that will keep the temperature really low so it doesn't continue fermenting. If you're doing it on a slightly smaller scale, you'll have corny kegs, and you'll need some kind of fridge unit, whether that's a walk-in fridge or a chest fridge, and you can store your finished kombucha in kegs there. But in the bottling process, I've seen brewers that will bottle in their cold room because it's easier. You don't get as much foaming. And certainly if you're in a hot area, particularly in the States, for instance, like, if you're in California in the middle of the summer and you're trying to bottle kombucha in a warehouse space that's open, there's going to be a lot of foaming. So keeping the liquid as cold as possible at all times during the filling process will keep down that over fizzing and keep it from secondary fermenting. How do you separate the cellulose from the starter liquid in your acetator? So when it comes to an acetator, you do get some level of sediment, but also pieces of cellulose that form throughout the process. But because the idea of an acetator is that the liquid is constantly agitated, so you're moving it constantly. In the one that we initially created, we have like a vortex thing. So like we have a pump at the bottom and it comes in the top through something called a Venturi valve, and then goes in the top and then sort of spins down in this cone formation. So the liquid is constantly moving, so it never gives it time to settle to create sort of a cellulose layer. So you'll get little strings and bits of cellulose, which you do need to clean out of the pipework every now and then, but that's okay. We actually are fine with having a cloudy sort of cellulose and oftentimes yeast-rich liquid, and it's going to be cloudy. It's going to have some matter in it, and that's okay. It's not until after we've finished brewing the kombucha. So we'll take the starter liquid, then we'll use that as a 25% base for our standard brews. And then after that 10-day fermentation cycle, at that point is when we filter out all that matter. So it's okay during the process to have stuff in the liquid, but you just don't want that layer to form on top. And having an acetator will allow that to move. But if something does form, you can just, sterilize your hands with some vinegar and get your hands in there, or use gloves probably is a better idea, and just take that layer off the top. If you're using an acetator that's not agitating the liquid enough, and you do have that layer form on top. Have you ever tried to brew a Cascara booch? Yes, we have made a Cascara booch before. Our friends at the Roasting Shed, before Cascara was made illegal in the UK, which is crazy. For those of you who don't know, Cascara, I believe, is the fruit of the coffee bean, the outside layer, and it has like a very berry, vanilla-y flavor. And if you steep that and ferment it, it's delicious. It's like sort of like a vanilla bean raspberry or something like that. That's sort of the essence that I get from it. But it's now not legal in the UK because of the fact that it's sort of a waste product in parts of Central and South America, and it's not often stored properly, and so they can't regulate the quality of it. So anyways, yes, we have made it. It's delicious. If you can get it, I would try it. It's really nice. But make sure you steam the Cascara before you steep it, because we had mold growth, which was really random the first time we did it. Shock tea living, we use yerba mate. Exactly, yerba mate is very similar to guayusa. I prefer guayusa. I find it has a more balanced, like, sort of buzz. I don't drink coffee, so guayusa is my source of caffeine, and I find it's just steady throughout the day with no crash at the end. So yerba mate gives me like a woo. I get like super energized from that. How do we find working with Duvel? Awesome. Duvel, they are, it's some of the best beer in the world. These guys know more about brewing and brewing a quality product than anyone I've ever met. So having their expertise is incredible. In particular, we're brewing at a facility now called Liefmans. Liefmans is in Oudenaarde, Belgium. And Liefmans has been around, I think, for like 200 and something years. It was 1600s. It's one of the world's first sour beers. And the guys that run the facility there are absolute geniuses when it comes to brewing. And it's an honor to be working with them. And, our plan is to launch Jar across Europe. So, using Duvel's logistical networks, using their brewing resources, it's a win-win. Our goal has always been to share Jar with as many people as possible throughout Europe. And in the UK, the market is so saturated that it's important that we sort of look further afield into markets where kombucha isn't as popular right now. So, explain how to do a liquid SCOBY correctly. I tried and failed. So, It depends on the scale that you're brewing at. A liquid SCOBY is simply another way of naming starter liquid. Starter liquid is a liquid SCOBY. If you have a microscope at your brewery, take some of your starter liquid, ideally starter liquid that's been brewed for like, if you're not agitating it with oxygen or manually, take starter liquid that's really old, but maybe like 2 months, something like that, 8 weeks to 12 weeks, and look at that under a microscope, and then cut off a piece of your cellulose and look at that under a microscope. And most of the time you'll find that the liquid itself contains more bacteria and sometimes yeast than you would find in the cellulose itself. An analogy that I use often is the idea that the cellulose that forms on top of your brew is a sponge. And that sponge soaks up the bacteria and yeast, which is actually housed already in the liquid. And in the starter liquid, it contains even higher amounts of bacteria and yeast because there's sort of a bell curve when it comes to the amount of bacteria produced throughout a kombucha ferment. After about anywhere between 6 to 12 months, the bacteria start dying off. More actually from the 9 month to 12 month mark, the bacteria start dying. But they spike really at like 2-3 months. So you get way more bacteria in that period of time than you would sort of in that cellulose. So I forgot where I was going with that, but yeah. So liquid SCOBY is just your starter liquid. So let your kombucha sit for 2 months. Remove that cellulose. Give it a stir every day. If you're doing it on a small scale, what we did initially was when we first discovered this method, we have this like stainless steel kayak paddle, and we just get the kayak paddle in the tank and stir it from bottom to top every single day for like maybe 10 minutes. And that would stimulate more bacteria growth, and we'd remove that layer of cellulose on the top. So we could get sort of a 2-month kombucha ferment in maybe a month if we were stirring it every single day. But then once we started introducing oxygen, initially in the form of a aquarium pump from the bottom to the top, some people start with a carb stone, something like that. That's when we started to understand we had way more control when we were controlling the actual amount of oxygen, instead of just like simply getting a stirring thing in there and just stirring the hell out of it. So do we flavor with tea at all? We don't flavor with tea. We use tea in our initial brew. We use a blend of oolong and green tea, and we find that that's a really nice light yet slightly complex base. And then we add, for our flavors, we add juice or sort of organic concentrates or purees and stuff like that. So for the oxygenation of the starter or kombucha, how often can I oxygenate my batch in a day? I have an aquarium pump equipped with a 2-micron stone. Oh, nice. Okay. It depends on the size vessel that you're using, but the idea is that you keep your oxygen going at all times. So it also depends on the system that you have, though. It's difficult to say because first of all, the bacteria and yeast that are found within your particular kombucha brew are completely different from anyone else's kombucha in the entire world. Unless, a scientist has come in and taken that sample and immediately locked it up in some kind of sealed case and, put it in a lab and recreated it. It's nearly impossible that anybody has what you have, which is amazing. It also makes it difficult to give exact advice because your bacteria and yeast will propagate differently at a different rate, at different temperatures, at different levels of oxygen to ours. So, but my word of advice is to oxygenate as much as possible. The bacteria wants oxygen. It gobbles it up, and it is the best thing you can give to your kombucha. So I would keep it on at all times, and then do tests on it, maybe every couple days. Taste it, do a qualitative analysis, and then do more of a quantitative analysis by testing the total acidity, the Brix, the pH, and then you can determine what's working for you. But you will see it will speed up the more you oxygenate it. That's sort of the idea. How do you favor gluconic acid over acetic acid? So that's a good question. And actually, I don't know the exact answer to this. This is something that Duvel is doing right now at our new facility in Belgium. So I haven't been fully indoctrinated into the ways that they've accomplished this. But what I understand is that it is a combination of heating, cooling, and pressure. So in the tanks that we have in Belgium, we can now manipulate the pressure inside the tank to favor different acids. And that's what we've done with our standard brew. We've actually upped the level of gluconic acid, which means that it's going to be more appley rather than just pure vinegar. Different kombuchas have different levels of both. And this is something I'll probably have to get back to you on. I don't know the exact specifics, but it is a 20,000 liter tank. We have 3 of those, and it's jacketed, so we can put boiling water, we can put like glycol through it, and we can chill it really quickly, we can heat it up really quickly, we can apply pressure, we can completely control the oxygenation of that tank. So through the wizardry of the, actually it's the Leafman's team. Leafman's is the brewery that's owned by Duvel, but it's a Leafman's team that has this expertise. So yeah, I'll dig into that and get back to you. If you send me a direct message, I'll ask them and let you know. What are your pH values for the starter liquid and the kombucha after mixing it with a 25% starter liquid? So, I mean, again, this depends on what you want your final brew to be at. Our starter liquid is not always consistent. It's not always, one specific pH. I would say that you want your starter liquid to be below 3, anywhere between like 2.5 and 2.8, something like that. But it's not so much the pH that matters, it's the total acidity. So I would start testing the total titratable acidity to give you an idea of the balance of all of the acids rather than just the pH itself, which is a much more accurate representation of the acidity of the actual kombucha. Now, anything obviously below a pH of 4 is a good place to start with brewing. If you want your kombucha to ferment faster, get a lower pH. Start at 3.5 or maybe a little bit lower, depending on the temperature that you're brewing at, depending on the oxygen in the room, depending on the strength of your bacteria and yeast. They all work it in different ways, and it's a difficult thing to say. Some places, there's some breweries that will use. They'll start fermenting at a pH of like 3.2 and then ferment for like 3 days to get it to 3 and they're done. We ferment for 10 days and that's at 24 degrees. And that for us seems to work quite well. And generally we're, as close to 4 as possible or a little bit below it. And we find that works quite well. But then our starter liquid, I guess, in general would probably be around 2.5, 2.6, something like that. Do you cold crash before carbonating? Absolutely. CO2 is, integrated into the liquid much more efficiently when it's as cold as possible. So our tanks, will take it down to 1 degree Celsius, right above freezing. And that means you can just get that oxygen in there, the CO2 in there and carbonate that liquid really quickly, really efficiently. If you're doing it in corny kegs, which we did for God knows how many years, 3.5 years, something like that, till we got a bright tank. We had at one time we had 100 corny kegs. Insane. I don't know where they all went, by the way. They just somehow disappeared. And you would want to put that in your fridge unit or some kind of chest fridge or, walk-in fridge as low as possible. You want that to be as cold as possible. It will speed up the process of making your kombucha fizzy. The colder, the better. Yeah, so answer is yes, we cold crash. How much sugar are you using for the liquid starter at the start of your main fermentation? It's a difficult thing to answer again because we have a formula. So we test the starter liquid for the bricks, for the total acidity, for the pH, and then we do also a qualitative analysis of it to see how the taste and smell is. And we will put those measurements into an Excel spreadsheet where we have a formula that will then spit out exactly what we want the tea, the tea brew to be in terms of the amount of sugar and what we want the level to be at, because it needs to balance itself. And then we always save a little bit of that starter for the next batch. So we have a starter for the starter, essentially. We have the starter, and then we have our primary fermentation process. So it's difficult to say exactly what the sugar is. It varies sort of batch to batch because it's not a perfect mechanism for creating the exact same level of everything every single time. It's always different, but we adapt to it. That's the most important part to remember. What ratio to oolong green tea do you use? And would you have any advice on resources or tea blends for newbie? So we use a 50-50 blend of green and oolong. We recommend anywhere between 4 to 6 grams per liter for tea. If you're brewing on a small scale, and then if you're brewing on a large scale, roughly the same amount actually. 50-50 for us just was a logical thing. It tasted nice. The oolong though is way more expensive than the green tea. So keep in mind, there is sort of a level at which you don't need to continue investing in super high quality tea, in terms of, like, I'm talking super premium, like rare tea. It's like diminishing returns in a way. What I would recommend you try out, and it's something I recommended in the last conversation with myself, sort of, that I did, where I sort of discussed, you can use a base that is good. It doesn't have to be the best tea you've ever found, but like pretty decent tea. So like a green tea or an oolong, or some people like a heartier black tea. But I'd recommend this. What I'm going to tell you, recommend using a light green tea, something like Essentia or a gunpowder in our case, and then you can do a cold brew infusion over a 12-hour period after your sort of fermentation is finished, after however long, 10 days, 2 weeks. Do a cold brew infusion of a really rare or really nice, high quality specialty tea. And that's something that we have done with a friend of ours named Don May, who runs Mayleaf Tea House in Camden. He's like the most knowledgeable person on tea that I've ever met. So he's got loads of videos on YouTube, actually, of which, there's a tour of our brewery on there and the health benefits of kombucha and how to make kombucha. But more importantly, he talks about tea. He talks about every type of tea you can ever imagine. But a really cool thing to do is to cold brew super like high quality tea in your finished kombucha, and you can extract amazing flavors. We did I think it was a honey orchid oolong, which tastes like nectarines, and that was on draft at his tea shop before the lockdown. So yeah, try that out. That's a better way to make use of good tea, rather than use it in your primary ferment, because a lot of that flavor you actually end up losing from the tea. It morphs into something else. So yeah, check that out. Do you see a market in kegging kombucha, hopefully then reducing carbon footprint of bottles? Yeah, good question. We were the first brand in Europe, I believe. I don't know if I can officially say that, but I do know in the UK we were the first brand to keg kombucha. And we actually kegged kombucha before we even put it in bottle. We opened up a tap room in 2015 called Jar Bar, which we thought was going to be this like amazing place that like loads of people would come every weekend and drink kombucha on tap, and nobody came because nobody knew what kombucha was here in the UK in 2015. And so we just started serving booze, and then we started having DJs come, and kombucha cocktails, DJs morphed into a nightclub. A lot of you may have heard this story before. Regarding kegs though, we've been continuing to produce kegs for the past, since 2015, so 5 years now. But we found that nobody wants to buy them. I mean, we have a few stockists, but it's probably the product that we sell the least amount of. So at the moment, we've put a hold on producing any more kegs. First of all, because they're primarily sold in the on-trade, so in bars and restaurants and cafes, stuff like that, where there are on-tap units, and everything's closed right now. So it was actually good timing that we decided to do that before the lockdown. But also because we don't think the market's quite there yet to justify the amount of time and effort that we have to put into filling these kegs. Unless you have like a kegging system, which some breweries, like beer breweries, will have, it's quite difficult to do. And it's difficult to ensure that it's going to be sterile, that you won't have cross-contamination of yeast that's in the air or, whatever. So we, at the moment, are not producing any more kegs. But yes, it's a great way of doing it. In the US, there's a market for it. It's huge. In most Whole Foods markets or many other supermarkets in California, you'll find kombucha on tap. It's big in Australia. It's big in New Zealand. I think it's something that's going to come, but I think the just kombucha in general, the industry needs to grow a bit before people decide to order it on draft. But I don't know if you guys saw this. Some of you may have already. But we've got kombucha in cans. We're going to launch this on our website, I think tomorrow. I'm just doing the back-end Shopify stuff. So we're just selling the raspberry right now. It's our first batch of it. Let us know what you think. We're also going to launch it on Farm Drop. So Carbon footprint of these, really good. So yeah, they're lighter and they're also infinitely recyclable. If you say there should be as much aeration as possible, why not using exclusively aerators for fermenting? Well, that is actually what we do now. So at the new facility at Liefmans in Belgium, as I mentioned, the tanks are completely closed. We're not doing an open top fermentation anymore. We're doing a completely closed 20,000 liter fermentation where we can control, as I mentioned earlier, the pressure, the temperature, and the aeration. So when you are able to brew at that scale, that's sort of the ideal, because you can fully control everything. We have an automated system that can be controlled by an iPad, essentially a computer system, and we can manipulate all of these things to ensure that the product we want or that we're going to produce has the right level of gluconic, acetic, sugar, ethanol. We can test the alcohol at all times to ensure it's a safe and consistent product. We still do, though, have to steep the tea manually and add the sugar. That's something that no computer or machine can do for you. So yeah, aeration constantly is what you want. But and if you look at photos on our Instagram, we have that our more recent iteration of the acetator, and that version is completely closed because we have something called a Venturi valve and a pump associated with that, which controls the flow of oxygen into it. So, initially we started with an open top fermentation using an aquarium pump just from the bottom. Initially kayak paddle for a while, then a aquarium pump, and then 2 aquarium pumps, and then a system that one of our brewers welded, basically stainless steel, like tubing that he welded in place inside the tank. And this allowed the sort of aquarium pumps to pump oxygen from the bottom and up through this tube, and then they'd create these big bubbles that would then come down and agitate or aerate the liquid more efficiently than just simply bubbling a little bit of oxygen up from the bottom. It was creating bigger bubbles, which meant that you could get more oxygen into liquid. The idea is you want to get as much oxygen as possible. More oxygen, better brew, better tasting, lower alcohol, higher amount of bacteria, quicker fermentation time, all good things. And then the yeast doesn't go nuts. Sometimes you get that, that funky kind of like sulfuric smell and flavor, and you're like, oh man, it's one of those like farty batches. That's what we used to call it, the farty batches. And so you want to oxygenate as much as possible, because then the bacteria will take more control than the yeast. The yeast is the one that likes to control stuff. The yeast is like the life of the party. It comes in, it just gobbles up everything, converts it into ethanol. The bacteria takes a back seat. It's a little bit more gentle. So if you prioritize the bacteria, it comes to the party a little bit more and does its thing, which is producing good tasting, clean, clear, delicious kombucha that's good for you. So do you plan to hold workshops again after the lockdown? Maybe. We're not sure yet. I might be doing more digital workshops. I mean, there's one that's posted on our Instagram page, and you can watch that. It's the same thing that I do for people, for some of our stockists and when I've done workshops in the past and in different places around London. It's the same exact format. So if people are interested in it, and maybe once in a while we'll do one, it takes a lot of time and effort to take, like 40 or 50. Actually, one of the last workshops I did was like 100 people. So it was me and one other person, our Jonas, one of our sales reps. We literally took 100 glass jars, loads of tea, loads of sugar, individually cut up cheesecloth that were put on top and rubber bands. I literally spent like 5 hours cutting cheesecloth just so it fit everyone's jar. So it takes a lot of effort to organize these workshops, but they're fun. I love it. I love interacting with people in that way, because kombucha is fun. It's fun to make, and it shows people how simple it is. And that's sort of the idea that I fell in love with, that anybody can do this at home. That's the great thing about kombucha. I'm using a pH meter and hearing about the total acidity for the first time. How is that measured? So if you look online at brewing equipment, you'll want essentially like a pipette, like a big sort of measuring I guess that's what you call it, like a glass pipette, and it will be held in place. And what you do is you will put a sodium hydroxide solution in there, and you'd have to get that from a brewing website or some kind of chemical supply store. You put some in there, you pour your kombucha into a little beaker underneath, and you slowly drop it. And each drop is a measurement. I don't know exactly what that measurement is, but each drop will interact with the kombucha. Basically, when it starts to turn purple, that's the level of total acidity. And so that's sort of a way of understanding the balance of the acids a bit more than just testing the pH. So if you look into total titratable acidity, there'll be some stuff online about sort of how to approach that and what equipment you're going to need. I struggle with 10 corny kegs. Can't imagine having 100. Yeah, it was a pain in the ass. Serious pain in the ass. Individually carbonating 100 corny kegs. And then trying to find, a fridge that worked. The fridge that we used to use would break down all the time, and it would only go to like maybe 8 or 9 degrees, which is not low enough to carbonate. We'd have to carbonate like 3 days in a row, and it was, it was a real pain in the ass. So invest in a good fridge unit. That's a big suggestion. Get a good fridge unit. When you're producing enough, get a bright tank. It'll save so much time. What's the right bricks pH balance? I mean, finished kombucha generally sits around a pH of 3, roughly. Anywhere between 2.9, 2.8 to 3.2. I mean, it really depends. The higher the pH, generally speaking, the sweeter the kombucha will be, the less acidic it will taste. Bricks-wise, totally up to you as well. We aim for a bricks of about 5. So, that'll give us like 5 bricks equates to roughly like 3.7 grams of sugar per 100 mils, 3.6% sugar, something like that. But you'll have to test it out to find out what flavor profile that you want. Here we go. What's the right bricks pH balance for starter tea? Again, I'm worried when using a starter tea that's too sour because it might not have enough sugar. No, a starter tea, it doesn't have to have loads of sugar. The sugar will come from the tea and the sugar, brew that you'll use for the primary ferment. The starter itself, can have a small amount of sugar. That doesn't really matter. Again, what I recommend is that you leave kombucha for like a couple months. Allow it to get really sour. It can still be sweet. It can be not sweet. It doesn't really matter. But when you're producing on a larger scale, you want to adapt your brew so you can have more of a consistent idea of what level of sugar and acidity you'll be left with after whatever the fermentation time is that you normally work with. I'm using around 80 grams of sugar per liter. What problems does it create? I mean, adding 30 more than what you recommend. So, you can use 80 grams of sugar. It's not going to be a problem. It's just that it's going to take longer for your kombucha to get to the desired level of, well, again, it's up to everybody what you guys want your kombucha to taste like, how long it takes to ferment. If you're using something like 80 grams of sugar, what I would personally do is ferment at a lower temperature. So something more like 20 degrees for 3 weeks, something like that, or 2.5 weeks, however long it takes, because it will more slowly consume that sugar and not convert it too quickly into acetic acid. If you use higher amounts of sugar, often you'll get a much more sour brew more quickly. So the lower the sugar, what we find is it just creates that nice balance. So our recommendation is always around 50, but you'll have to test that with trial and error to figure out what works for you. But 80 grams of sugar per liter is not going to do anything that's going to damage your brew or mess it up or anything. But when I've had people visit us in London and I've met fellow kombucha brewers and they give me their home brews, they're often delicious, obviously, really, really tasty kombucha, but they're often too sweet. And I think that's because people think that they need to use more sugar than they actually do. And when I first started brewing on a small scale, everything I'd heard was 120 grams per liter. So that's what I started with. And that's just too much. You don't actually need that. So we recommend when you're brewing for the first time at home, use 60. Start with a little bit higher than what we recommend just to kickstart that process to make sure you have enough of the fuel for your yeast and your bacteria to ferment. But you can go down to 50 just fine. You can probably even go down to 40 without starving the culture, but it really depends on trial and error and how your, again, the strength of your bacteria and yeast. It really comes down to your, how your SCOBY works and what it needs. Speaking about sustainability, I understand cans need to be lined with plastic because of the kombucha acidity. No, this in particular is not lined with plastic. What happens with kombucha nowadays, because so much of it is canned, is you send a sample of your kombucha into the canning company. In our case, we use Ball, which is one of the biggest can producers in the world. They spend 3 weeks and they charge you like thousands. I think it was like 3,000 pounds or something to have this test done. It was insane. And they test the different linings of different cans to determine which one works best for your kombucha without leaching any chemicals. And there's a guarantee that it won't leach any chemicals. So technically, it's a case-by-case basis, but they don't need to be lined with plastic for kombucha acidity necessarily at all. Have you had any experience in using old starter liquid with a low pH in combination with a short fermentation time, 1 to 2 days? Well, this is something that, there's some companies out there that recommend you do this. And there's some brewers that do this. Personally, we're fans of what we're doing now is not technically old-fashioned kombucha brewing. It's more modern kombucha brewing, but using the same ingredients and using the same process, a 10-day fermentation time, but we're just doing it closed vessel, as I've sort of talked about. So what you're referring to is more of a pared back kombucha. It's not something that I personally like. I like kombucha that's been properly fermented, but that's just a personal opinion. I suspect that a lot of other people here probably feel the same way, but if you're just using old starter liquid with sweet tea, then it's not giving it enough time to properly ferment. Ideally, you want to ferment for at least 7 days. That's what we recommend in order for the liquid to develop that complexity, in order for the bacteria and yeast to do their job and convert those sugars into the acids. So you can do that for sure, and it actually probably creates a more consistent, safe product in a lot of ways. But that would be more like a sour soft drink, I guess, rather than a brewed kombucha. But again, I'm a fan of all kombucha. I'll drink any kombucha anywhere in the world. I don't care. I'm just happy people are making it. And technically, kombucha is classified as anything that has fermented tea in it. So, but yeah, that it's not something we've done, but it's something you can do for sure. And actually, if your starter liquid is sour enough, then you're still getting the benefits of the acids. So and you still got the tea in there. So same kind of thing. For a new brewery, what are your thoughts on bottling can versus glass? Well, we started with glass bottles. Cans are a bit more difficult because odds are, you're not going to invest in a canning machine initially. You can get bottling machines for a hell of a lot cheaper than a canning machine, unless you're doing manual cans, which would be a real pain in the ass. And they're inconsistent. The problem we found initially with canning kombucha was that nobody wanted to touch it. And I don't know if anyone else is having that issue anywhere in the world right now, but most of the canners are mobile canners. Many of them are mobile canners in the UK, and they can beer. They make most of their money canning beer around the UK. And beer and kombucha are like cats and dogs. They they really don't mesh well. Like there's Acetobacter, the most commonly found bacteria strain in kombucha, is like a sworn enemy of beer. It can infect an entire brewery and they'd have to throw away everything. So canning companies aren't willing to take a risk on canning kombucha in small volumes when they've got loads of business from beer breweries because of cross-contamination. So canning's a bit more difficult. Obviously, it's better for the environment. I really like kombucha out of a can. I think it's really fresh. It can also be just as fresh in a bottle though, and bottling is probably a better way to start. Depends on your business model though. It really comes down to that. I mean, here at Jar, we started with a premium bottle. We still sell that. It's our flagship product. And we've now launched this can just to test the market, to see what people think about it. It is about 21% cheaper than our bottles. Although, secret, this actually costs more to make than our bottles because we did a really small run of it. So when you're doing small runs of anything, they're going to cost way more. your price, your price per unit doesn't go down until you're producing a lot more. But you can offer cans, generally speaking, if you're doing large quantities at a lower volume, or sorry, a lower price point. They're better for the environment. They're just as fresh. They're lighter in terms of transport, but bottles are more premium. So it depends on how you want your brand to be seen, where you want to be sold, what effect you want to give to consumers of your product. So, do you oxygenate with pure oxygen or just filtered, purified air? Good question. It's a really good question. Nowadays, we oxygenate with pure oxygen, but that's because we're in a facility that can justify that, and it's completely safe. The problem is, if you're doing that on a small scale or a home brew, pure oxygen is extremely flammable. It will blow up like a bomb, and it is super dangerous. So you got to be really careful if you're using pure oxygen, that you know what you're doing. Purified air, filtered air is just fine. That's what we used. Oh, excuse me. Got a tickle in my throat. You can use the air inside your brewery. I mean, that's what we used for ages. But we had a specific air filtration unit. And I've told this story before, I think. But before we had an air filtration unit, I would brew the kombucha in the same room that I would answer my emails in. And I'd get really spaced out and almost fell asleep a couple times and didn't understand what the problem was, and CO2 intoxication. I probably killed a lot of brain cells. Lucky I didn't fall asleep, because that's one of the most common causes of death in a brewery is, if you're in a beer brewery, somebody opens up a tank, take a big breath of CO2, pass out in liquid. So these are just things you got to keep in mind. That was a side story, but you can use the oxygen in the room as long as you're sucking out that CO2 through some kind of filtration unit. Yeah, that'll be totally fine. Do you oxygenate from the beginning of fermentation, or do you wait some days in order not to have the yeast to grow? Good question. This is something I mentioned the last Q&A that I did. The type of acetator that we use, or were using up until recently, was a closed vessel acetator. And what we would do is it was closed on top. We'd put all of the ingredients in there, which was starter from a previous batch, and then our sweet tea, and we'd let it sit for 5 days. So this is actually something you can probably do even if you don't have some fancy acetator. Use some starter liquid and then use some sweetened tea, and then whether you're using a jar or a small tank or a big tank, cover that. Block the oxygen from getting into it. Leave it for 5 days. And what happens is that the alcohol, it creates an anaerobic environment. The yeast goes nuts with the sugar, produces high amounts of alcohol or ethanol, which is not what you want at the end of the fermentation, but it is what you want at the beginning of the fermentation, particularly if you're producing starter liquid. So for instance, for us, it would go up to 3% alcohol, sometimes 3.5%, super boozy. And then we switch on the pump, and immediately, or not immediately, but quite quickly, that ethanol would be consumed by the acetobacter and converted into acetic acid. So we found that our culture in particular loved gobbling up alcohol, and that's how we produced our acetic acid. And then the final product is like 0.2% ABV. It's insane. And that's how an acetator works on an industrial scale. So again, I mentioned this in the last Q&A, but if you're interested in exploring what these things look like on a bigger scale, and sort of basing your own design off that, if you're working with an engineer or somebody that really knows what they're doing, and can make you like an at-home acetator like one of our brewers, Matt, created for us, base it off of Frings, Frings, those are based in Germany, or Cetotech, Cetotech. Cetotech or Frings. Check those out. And they do the same thing. You get the alcohol level super high, you switch on the oxygen, and the bacteria gobbles that ethanol up and converts it into acids. So that's essentially how white wine vinegar is made, apple cider vinegar is made, all types of vinegar on an industrial scale is made in the same way. I'm probably way behind on these questions, and I've only got 9 minutes to go, I think, before it boots me out. So I'm going to try and get through as many as I can. If you guys want me to do another one of these, I'm happy to do another one at some point. It's all about oxygen and prioritizing the bacteria. Why use yeast at all? Well, the yeast and bacteria work in a symbiotic way. This is important because the yeast converts the sucrose, that's the sugar, and does this thing of splitting that into fructose, glucose, and ethanol. So without the yeast, it wouldn't break down the sucrose and turn it into the fructose and the glucose and the ethanol. And then in that symbiotic relationship, the bacteria comes in, specifically the acetobacter, and it will gobble up the ethanol, convert that into acetic acid. It will gobble up the fructose and convert that as well into acetic acid. And then the gluconobacter will come in and convert the glucose into gluconic acid. So that's sort of the process. Without the yeast, it simply would remain as sucrose, and then the bacteria wouldn't be able to do their job. So it's necessary to have both involved, but you want the bacteria to do a little bit more, because the yeast creates funny flavors and alcohol. Let's see here. Fermentation flavoring with dried herbs and flowers, elderflower, roses, thyme, so no fruits at all. Do you think it can help for kombucha not to over ferment to not carbonating? I don't fully understand that. As I mentioned earlier, doing a dry hop or doing a cold brew infusion of these herbs and flowers after the fermentation of your primary brew is the best way to extract flavor, and in some cases beneficial properties from these things. So maybe if you're going to do an infusion of that, maybe under ferment it by a little bit, if that's what you're asking, and maybe a couple days, and then let those sit in there maybe overnight, or depending on how strong you want the flavor to be, how much of these herbs or flowers that you're using, leave it for a couple days. It's totally up to you, but yeah, you just don't want it to get too sour. So how do you oxygenate only starter batch, or also when brewing finished product? So basically the way that we brewed for many years, for 4.5 years, we would only oxygenate the starter liquid. We don't actually do that in the primary ferment, and this is a common, maybe a misconception about how we were brewing. The starter liquid is what we would oxygenate the hell out of. And then our primary ferment, we would have a 25% starter base, and then we just leave that. We don't actually oxygenate that. We find that just removing the cellulose, it turns it over quickly enough. When we're using a liquid SCOBY that has enough bacteria in it and is non-alcoholic, just leaving that for 10 days is enough. I mean, sometimes we would stir it and stuff like that with a kayak paddle, but oxygenating that particular brew in a 1,000-liter vessel with an open top, we didn't find we needed to do. But the way that we're doing it now is we are oxygenating all aspects of the brewing process, from the starter liquid to the primary ferment, but not the flavoring process. So again, it's different for everyone's different brews, and it's also different based on the scale you're brewing, the equipment that you have. So I would start in small jars, test out various methods, and then work your way up to your larger tanks. And then you don't want to lose an entire batch because you've over fermented it, or the yeast has gone nuts, or whatever. You want to make sure that that you sort of have an idea of the way your SCOBY's functioning before going all in on a brew using specific methods. What sugar do we use? We use an organic cane sugar from Brazil. We just like the flavor of it. It's like a blonde, extra light cane sugar. Something a lot of brewers ask is, can I use a raw sugar? We recommend you use the most refined sugar possible, actually. So an organic, ideally, cane sugar, beet sugar works too. But the smaller the granules, the more efficiently it's going to be consumed by the yeast, converted into the ethanol, the fructose, and the glucose, and then consumed by the bacteria. So when you're using a raw cane sugar, which can create a really nice flavor, but it contains molasses and other minerals, which can slow the ability of the yeast to consume that sucrose. So yeah, refined sugar, cane sugar. We get it from a place in the UK called Kent Foods, but it's a company, I think it's called Nativa, Nativa. I think quite a few kombucha breweries in the UK use it. Momo Kombucha, who's a really great brewery here in London. I saw a photo they posted, they use the same sugar as well. I've only got 4 minutes to go, so I'm just going to, do you bottle in-house or outsource it? We've always bottled in-house. We looked into outsourcing, but it was too expensive. To be honest though, best piece of advice is if there is someone that will take care of your kombucha and has a good bottling line, or they will let you use their bottling line, or you can oversee bottling, have someone else do it for you, actually. It was the biggest pain in our ass to bottle kombucha. It's really difficult to, it became easy for us to produce the kombucha, but to get that liquid into bottle, man, it's expensive. You gotta, the way that we were doing it for many years was a very manual process. The bottling machine, by the way, that we were using for a long time is from a brand called Cespedes, CESPEDES, and it's a Spanish company, really good sort of gravity filling unit. But you'd have to have a team of like 4 people minimum that are taking the bottles out, sanitizing them, washing them, sending them down the line. We'd have 2 bottling lines side by side, so people back to back doing these, sending them over, hand capping every single bottle, packaging them or wiping them down, packaging them, and then, drying them, labeling them. I mean, man, it's a long process. If you get somebody to do that for you and you still make your margins, it'll save you a lot of time. And then you can focus primarily on the fermentation, which is the most important part, creating the liquid, I suspect that many of you out there that are brewers or opening a kombucha brewery, you guys care about the liquid, you care about the product. And bottling can be fun for a while, but let me tell you, it becomes a real pain in the ass quite quickly. So, let's see. So 1 Brix equivalent to 1 gram of sugar per 100 mils. Yeah, this is a common misconception. A Brix is not exactly, specifically in kombucha fermentation, it's not an exact representation of the grams of sugar per 100 mils. And that's because there's fructose, glucose, and sucrose showing up in the final product, and a blend of acids. Acidity can skew the results. So what I recommend you do is measure your Brix, make note of it, and then send that exact batch into a lab to test the sugar content. And then you can get a direct correlation for how that works. And that might vary actually based on different kombucha brews, depending on the level of different types of sugar and different types of acids that you have in your kombucha. So yeah, I'd always recommend sending samples into a lab. It's expensive, but it's worth it. At one point we even had somebody do an entire sequencing of the DNA of our kombucha, and we found that there was a strain of Acetobacter, a specific version of it that they'd never seen before. Totally safe for consumption, but it wasn't. There was no name for it. So it's crazy that all of our kombuchas have completely different makeups of bacteria and yeast. Ours was primarily Acetobacter and Gluconobacter, a little bit of Lactobacillus, but not much. Different brands, different parts of the world have different types of bacteria and yeast. That's the beautiful thing. I'm sorry, I didn't get through all of these. So you know what? I'll do another one either next week or the week after, whatever works for people. If this time works for everyone, send me a message. If there's better times that work for people, let me know. Just send a direct message to us, and we'll try and answer, all the other questions. I got caught up in these, and I just waffle. I'm so sorry. There's so many more on here. Let's see. Stopping fermentation between 3.5 and 3.8. 3.5 tastes super sour. Yeah, I mean, it might be you have too much sugar and too much acetic acid. So I can't tell exactly what the issue would be, but that can often be a common issue, that the sugar is too high. So I'd lower your sugar content to start with. Anyways, 15 seconds ago, guys. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm going to put these cans online tomorrow, so if anybody wants to try them out, delivery in the UK, and I'll post about when I'm going to do this next. Bye, guys. Have a good night.